Sumo stance is not fucking better for your glutes in any capacity.
But sumo deadlifts aren't a great exercise to build your glute.
Here is why sumo is not the best for your fucking glutes.
The wider the stance does not mean more glutes. That's a big misconception. If your glutes aren't growing, squat normally. Don't do sumo squats.
Are these biomechanical bros telling the truth, or is there more to the story? In this video, we're going to review all the evidence pertaining to sumo/wide versus conventional/narrow. Welcome to the channel. My name is Bret Contreras. I'm also known as the Glute Guy. I've been lifting weights for 34 years and I've been a personal trainer for 30 years. I've owned gyms for the past 20 years. I invented the barbell hip thrust in 2006 and I invented the entire glute niche. I love all things glutes. I love biomechanics. I love every aspect of strength training, from bodybuilding to strength sports, even to physical therapy. If it involves helping you look and feel better, then that's my passion. For those of you who are new to the channel, I offer Booty by Bret for programming, and I have BC Strength where we sell high quality glute equipment, especially designed for women and for home gym. You might want to look at BC Strength for your lady, because when she gets better glute development, who benefits more, you or her? Nevertheless, welcome to the channel. So this is an interesting topic for me because I was born in 1976, right? I'm 49 years old. I started lifting in 1992 when I was 16 years old. And from 1992 to, I would say, 2020, so for about 28 years, sumo/wide stance was thought to be better for glute development than conventional/narrow stance. And then in 2020, the tides turned. This is when TikTok was on the rise. We had some influential content creators point out that wide stance is probably more adductor and therefore perhaps it's less glute, and the biomechanical bros ran with it. For a solid year or two, all I saw was sumo is all adductor, zero glute. And I made a post back in 2021, I believe, saying sumo isn't no glutes. It could be just as much glutes, but I didn't elaborate like I will today. That post seemed to have calmed things down, but it didn't squash things, and I still to this day see people claiming that sumo is very ineffective for glute development and that you should always go narrow no matter what the instance. Now, I wish we could point to a handful of studies on the topic and say, look, there are 5 hypertrophy studies that have been conducted. In fact, we have a review paper and a meta-analysis including these 5 papers, but we don't have any of that. As of November 2020, there are 0 training studies examining wide versus narrow stances on glute hypertrophy. Crazy. You'd think someone along the way would have been interested in this topic. In the absence of training studies actually measuring hypertrophy, we have to go down the list and look at biomechanical clues. So in today's video, we're going to look at 4 different lines of evidence, all of which are problematic. We're going to look at anecdotes and discuss the pitfalls of that. We're going to look at EMG and hip loading research and discuss their shortfalls. We're going to look at muscle length and discuss the limitations of that. And we're going to look at mechanical tension and discuss the problems with that line of research. But this is what being evidence-based is all about. So first up, anecdote. All right, you, the listener, are watching this and you probably feel very strongly about sumo versus conventional or wide versus narrow, just like I do, but your opinion on the topic is likely very influenced by your hip anatomy. Let's talk about myself for a minute. I love sumo and flaring my feet out. It feels so much better for me. If I do low bar sumo box squats or even free squats where I do them very glute dominantly, sitting really far back and feeling that stretch load on the glutes, I actually have to worry about tearing my glutes. Like, that's how much tension is put on the glutes. So for me, I think they're one of my best glute exercises. I mean, it's literally the only exercise I have to worry about. So for me, it could be numero uno. And yes, I feel more stretch loading on the glutes doing wide sumo than I do doing narrow work. But that's probably influenced by my hip anatomy. I've always walked duck-footed. I even take a wide stance when I walk. People see me walking and they make fun of me, and I've been that way my whole life. A lot of my family members walk that way. I've trained clients over the years who can't tolerate sumo. It hurts their hip. So you, the listener, are probably going, yeah, that's me. I hate sumo. It doesn't feel right for me. Or you might say, I hate going narrow. That doesn't feel right for me. For me, going super narrow hurts my hips, and I feel like I can't get that deep. So for that reason alone, we cannot go by anecdotes because it's so influenced by our hip anatomy, but also a huge confounder is that no lifter ever just does wide or narrow. we all do a blend. Case in point, most lifters do single leg work. So yes, you might do your squats and your deadlifts and maybe even your leg press all in a sumo stance, but when you do single leg work like step ups, Bulgarians, lunges, or even single leg RDLs or even single leg hip thrusts, you are using a narrow stance. You never go out wide with those. You can't, you would fall over. Now, yes, you could do like ballerina Bulgarians to be more abducted and make it more replicable to sumo, but hopefully you get my point. Even single leg press, we tend to put our foot in the middle. So whenever someone sees good glute gains, you never really know what exercise it came from. Unless, for example, you've been on a particular routine and then you switch the focus, like let's say you've always done narrow and then you switch to sumo and you notice a ton of glute growth, yes, then that's very telling, but it's rarely the case where we just change up one thing. In our normal training, we change too many things and we fail to control the variables, rendering anecdotes unreliable for solid evidence. Now let's talk about EMG and hip loading studies. I currently have a folder with 29 of these studies, okay? Looking at either EMG activity with the glutes going narrow versus wide, or like hip loading. We call them moments, which is kind of like the torque requirements on the hips during a movement. So while I'm talking, I'll show you the 29 studies, but I'm not going to review them for 3 reasons. Number 1, we found out in the 2023 Plotkin study that EMG does not predict hypertrophy. It probably predicts active muscle force well, but not stretch. And both are important for muscle growth, active and passive muscle force. So EMG alone doesn't tell the whole story. Also, hip moments don't predict hypertrophy because you can have greater hip extension requirements or greater hip abduction or external rotation moments and requirements, but there are multiple hip extensors, multiple hip abductors, and multiple hip external rotators. So if an exercise involves more hip extension moments, that could be carried out by the gluteus maximus, or it could be carried out more so by the adductor magnus or the hamstrings. Same with, for example, say seated hip abduction, which is transverse plane abduction. Well, that could be the gluteus maximus, or it could be the posterior fibers of the glute medius and minimus, or the deep hip external rotators like the piriformis. So while EMG and hip moments give you clues, they don't provide solid evidence, so I'm not going to look into much. And I also want to mention that these papers are very conflicting. Like, you can find a variety of papers showing that sumo is superior for glute EMG activity and loading on the hips, and several papers showing it's inferior. So if someone wanted to cherry pick, they could make a compelling case either way. Now let's talk about anatomy. There are a couple of recent papers that provide good clues about this topic of sumo versus conventional. The first is Anecdotes 2025. And this paper showed that we've been wrong the entire time about where we thought that the glutes attached to. Looks like we got the origins right, but the insertions wrong. Crazy to find that out in 2025. But you can see in this image here that the upper and lower gluteus maximus are distinctly separate structures. They originate and insert into different places. And you can see that the lower fibers are much longer than the upper fibers. Next up is another brand new study, Takahashi 2025. And this paper is really cool because check out this image. You see the hip center of rotation, okay? I want you guys to look at this image and picture doing abduction. Picture raising your leg out to the side. Well, the fibers above the center of rotation would shorten. So when you go wide, those fibers would get shorter, but the fibers below the center of rotation would elongate. So the lower gluteus maximus, you can see, would get longer from sumo. And that's just in the frontal plane. But then they took it a step further and they looked at specific torques produced by the different fibers. And what they found was the superior glutes create a net abduction moment, meaning that when activated, they will tend to pull the leg outwards. But the lower gluteus maximus, the inferior fibers, have the opposite effect. They will tend to pull the leg inwards and have an adduction moment because they're stretched when you go wider. When activated, it's going to pull in a little bit. So the net effect of the entire gluteus maximus contracting would be a neutral effect because the abduction torques generated by the upper fibers and the adduction moments generated by the lower fibers cancel each other out. Pretty fascinating paper, but that does give us clues that maybe sumo is better for the lower glutes. And then finally, this same Plotkin 2023 paper I talked about that showed that EMG did not predict hypertrophy. This study did find that the lower gluteus maximus grew the most in comparison to the upper and middle fibers. So I'll put the image up here. As you can see, the squat group, upper glute max grew 12.8%, middle 10.1%, and lower 19.2%. And with the hip thrust group, upper glute max 13.7%, middle 10.7%, and lower 21.5%. So you're almost seeing double the growth in the lower gluteus maximus because the glute max is just thicker in the lower region. And this is important because TikTok and Instagram have made the shelf popular over the last several years. Everyone's talking about upper glute growth. In fact, this was talked about in bikini as well. Bikini competitions, all the feedback was always, you need more upper glutes. But before 2020, from like as far back as I remember, like in the 90s up until like 2020, the upside down heart-shaped glutes sought after, and it's that lower glute max development that everyone wanted. The problem with that is a lot of the exercise best for the lower glutes also work the legs very well, making it tough to just build lower glute max. Your vertical hip extension exercise, all your squats, single leg squatting movements like step-ups, lunges, and Bulgarians, and your Romanians, single leg Romanians, good mornings, even leg press, single leg press, they tend to activate the lower glute max a little better than they do the upper glute max. But I should mention that the Plotkin study found similar growth between squats and hip thrusts in all three regions. Casting doubt on whether you can truly isolate lower versus upper glute max growth. We need more research on that too. Nevertheless, these just provide us with clues and should be taken into consideration. But now let's talk about muscle length. Let's talk about stretch. So I'm bringing out Skelly here, and it's difficult to model this because there is a lot of inter-individual variability with attachment points. Now the glute max originates on the pelvis, the sacrum, even the coccyx, and it inserts onto the gluteal tuberosity. But like I said, there's a lot of variation here. So as I mentioned, because the leg kind of comes inwards, let's see how you have some of the upper fibers contracting. As this would pull together, you could see how it would shorten and kind of raise the leg outwards. However, if you have a lower fiber, you can see here how going wider would lengthen the glute a little bit. So the lower glute max fibers would be lengthened a little bit from going wider. And while I love using the skeleton for demonstration purposes, and I think it's invaluable for biomechanists, a couple problems with the skeleton is this to scale? Did they get the hip anatomy right? Shouldn't this femur be sucked in more? Should the Q angle be more severe? Should the leg come in more? Is the ridge of the gluteal tuberosity accurate? In general, fibers tend to be oriented around a 45-degree angle. Some plastic skeletons, you don't see that because it's all out of whack, but also there's no wrapping element. Muscular tissue has a thickness to it, and as you move through a range of motion, you don't always capture that. For example, if I just represent this with a straight line and I move up into hip flexion to stretch the glutes, sometimes what you'll see is this cord doesn't stretch. See that? It just moves up with it. In real life, you're gonna have a wrapping element like this, so you're gonna see more stretch. Yes, it does flatten out a little bit, but it doesn't come up through the hip joint center. So muscles have bulk to them, and the skeleton can't portray that wrapping element. So I'm gonna show you guys a video here of a freakishly strong and muscular woman performing a deadlift variation here. And the reason why I'm using this is you can actually see her glutes. You need a shredded, muscular person to see how the glutes actually behave, and we can't capture that with the skeleton. Now here's what some research try to do to provide a solution for that straight line musculoskeletal model. We either try to make multiple points so it's not a straight line, a series of segments, or they place a sphere in there so that the line wraps around it, and these models are never perfect, which I'll get to in a minute. Nevertheless, we could see with the skeleton that it does make sense that abduction is going to lengthen the glutes. So yes, we could see that going wider in the frontal plane tends to lengthen the glutes. We're also involving the sagittal plane by going into a squat. So when you go wide and then you end up going deep, do you end up with a better stretch when going deep compared to when going narrower? This is hard to model. We need mass in there, we need thickness to it, and we'd have to see how it wraps under. And since it wraps under, you would think the most stretch on the glutes would be achieved with a narrower stance compared to wider stance when sinking really deep into hip flexion. This is when you might see narrower stretch the glute max more, even the lower fibers compared to going wide. So this is where musculoskeletal modeling comes into play. All right guys, so I'm gonna introduce you to OpenSim. This is a musculoskeletal modeling software created by Scott Delp. He's a Stanford biomechanics professor, and it's free. So some of you biomechanics geeks might wanna download this and learn it and toy around with it. So I'm gonna show you some charts here, okay? I've got charts for you to check out. The first one is gonna look at the upper glute max when you go narrow versus wide, or conventional versus sumo. Here is the stretch stretch on the upper glute max doing a conventional deadlift or a narrow stance squat or a single leg press with a narrow stance. Now let's look at the second chart. What happens when you go wide? When you go sumo, take a wider stance, you can see that you get less stretch on the upper glutes. So if length was important, sumo would be less effective for upper glute max development. Now let's look at the middle glute max. Here's what you get going narrow, and now here is what you get going wider. As you can see with middle glute max, you get less length change as well. Sure, in very short ranges, in extreme ranges of hip hyperextension that most people don't even have the ability to reach here, you will see a longer glute. But for the ranges we see during these movements, which would probably be 0 degrees, like neutral, all the way to like maybe, 100, maybe 110 degrees of hip flexion, narrow has the advantage for greater stretch. Okay, but what about the lower gluteus maximus? Remember, the lower gluteus maximus has the longest fibers and also grow the most from hip extension training. They can increase their muscle volume by 20% in just a couple months of progressive resistance training using either squats or hip thrusts. What happens to the length of the lower glute max when you go from narrow to wide? Well, here's a chart showing narrow stance and here's a chart showing wider stance. Now this range is crazy. It goes from 30 degrees of hip hyperextension all the way to 140 degrees of hip flexion for a total of 170 degrees hip range of motion, and that's a lot. Most people don't have 30 degrees of hip hyperextension mobility. Most people don't have 140 degrees of hip flexion mobility, and even so, you don't reach those ranges during these movements. Like I said earlier, I guess with the masses, it would be maybe like neutral, like 0 degrees up until like maybe 110 degrees. I'm just guessing, it could be off by that, but it's gonna be individual specific. It's gonna have a lot to do with your anthropometry, whether you're doing squats versus deadlifts, your arm length. If you have longer femurs, you'll lean forward more. If you have longer arms, you'll lean less. But if we look at this chart, we can see from 30 degrees of hip hyperextension all the way to about 80 degrees of hip flexion, sumo actually stretches the glutes more. And then from deep hip flexion, from 80 degrees to 140, the advantage goes to narrow stance. So what does this mean? Well, I'm going to bring up the Plotkin 2023 study again. As I mentioned earlier, Plotkin 2023 showed that EMG did not predict hypertrophy. You know what else it showed? That stretch did not predict hypertrophy because squats stretch the glutes more and squats and hip thrusts tied for glute growth. So stretch does not automatically predict hypertrophy. We've seen that in the case of the glutes. We've seen it with delts. We've seen it with some studies on the quads and the arm muscles. It's gonna have a lot to do with the inherent biomechanics of the exercise, but it also may have to do with the muscle in question. So talk to any muscle hypertrophy specialist and ask them, what is the primary driver of muscle hypertrophy? What drives muscle growth? And they will answer mechanical tension. Tension on the muscle is thought to be the primary factor. Anything else is thought to be a far second or third factor for muscle growth. For example, metabolic stress, muscle damage, hormones. These are thought to play a very minor role or even a negligible, or they could even be counterproductive in some circumstances. So what is mechanical tension? Well, in biomechanics, we call it muscle force. And I want to show you how OpenSim models muscle force with the gluteus maximus. So if you move through a full range of motion, this is with a narrow stance, you will see both active and passive force curves. For active force comes from activating the motor unit. So picture maximally activating the gluteus maximus muscle, and that red line shows you the force that's produced from the active component. And now you see the blue line as well. Those forces come from stretching the glutes through a full range of motion. So you've heard that stretch is everything. Well, what gives? Why is it stretch adding way more tension than this? I don't know. Musculoskeletal modeling is very challenging. You have to rely on a lot of assumptions. So is this realistic? Unfortunately, we don't have any studies on the length tension relationship, so we don't know the active and passive force angle curves as you move throughout the range of motion. But the way this biomechanical software program models the glute max is it does not show the stretch adding a ton of tension. We also don't know if active and passive tension provide unique hypertrophy stimuli. Do you get some signals coming from being activated and having that pulling force and different signaling coming from stretch signaling as the muscle is stretched, or is it just total tension on the muscle, regardless of whether it comes from active or passive elements? There is some evidence that tighten is going to become much stiffer when it's activated. But if you activate a muscle through the full range of motion, is it just total tension or are there unique stimuli? Unfortunately, we don't know the answer to this yet. So we're just going to look at total tension. So if I blend the red and blue lines together, you come up with one line, the green line here. This is your total muscle force throughout the range of motion. And you see on this chart here that you get peak tension from around 20 to 40 degrees of hip flexion. And as you continue to stretch the glutes, total tension doesn't rise up past that peak component in the middle range there. So if this length tension curve is accurate, this casts doubt on whether stretch is very important for glute growth. As long as you reach 40 degrees of hip flexion, you're good. You don't need to go deeper than that. But I doubt this is accurate. Models rely on a ton of assumptions. Nevertheless, I redrew that green line to make it a red line here to compare it to Sumo. So here you have conventional or narrow stance, this red line here, and now you go wide and you have a blue line, and that is the tension curve or the total muscle force curve with hip extension in a wide stance. Now, I used 50 degrees of abduction. I don't know if that's accurate. Maybe I went overboard. This would be going really wide. And again, this is just for the lower glute max. We're just looking at lower glute max here, but looking at muscle force, you get the same peaks. Yes, you're getting more tension on the glutes at shorter ranges using Sumo, but then you're getting more tension at longer ranges going narrow. If you're at the far right of the graph, say you were just doing super deep pulses, you only do length and partials, then judging by this graph, you'd probably see more tension on the glutes doing narrow stance compared to wide stance. On the other hand, if all you do is shortened pulses, instead of length and partials, you're doing shortened partials, you're doing hip thrust lockouts, you're doing 45-degree hyper lockouts, then this would suggest that you'd see better results going wide compared to going narrow. So should we be doing hip thrust pulses with a wide stance for the lower glute max? Maybe we should. We have muscle length and mechanical tension evidence using musculoskeletal modeling that suggests that it is beneficial. So how do these models work? You have to input a lot of characteristics. They're very complicated. I remember really looking into it with Coach Chasm, and we found a lot of flaws. He geeked out on it. And we were looking at the effects of, for example, hypertrophy, like having very muscular glutes on these length tension relationships. We found out one model changed the tendon slack in order to make it work. But how do you know what the tendon slack of the gluteus maximus is? I've never seen that measured. So while I don't think musculoskeletal modeling is all that, I hope what you can deduce from this video is nothing is all that. Nothing aside from training studies is all that, because we've seen pitfalls with EMG, with stretch, with musculoskeletal modeling, and with anecdotes. And even with training studies, you can have flaws because sometimes the researchers don't employ top-notch coaches and they don't know how to coach the lifts properly. So when you see a training study, you're assuming that proper form was used, proper progression, because it's not always the best coaches that are helping to carry out these training studies. The other thing about this modeling research is it's hard to replicate the ranges of motion. You tend to pick one point and then model it through a range, but it doesn't model what's actually happening. For example, in my model, all I did was kick the thigh out to 50 degrees of abduction, but when you come down into a sumo deadlift, in deep hip flexion, you're internally rotating the femurs a little bit, and then as you come up, you're externally rotating the hips, and you can't include that in on the model. So you don't get 3D modeling here. It kind of represents 2 dimensions, and it's not gonna replicate the natural 3D movement that we see in the hip socket, being a ball and socket joint, which is capable of hip flexion and extension, hip abduction and adduction, and hip internal and external rotation. Now let's talk about some practical consideration. Check out this picture of different hip anatomies, okay? Our hips come in all shapes and sizes. You have different heads of the femur, different orientation of the sockets, different depth of the sockets, different pelvic shapes. The angles are oriented uniquely. You may have a particular hip anatomy that is very well suited for going narrow, but not well suited for going wide, or vice versa. You may be built to go wide, but not built to go narrow, at least when going deep, right? These unique hip anatomies tend to appear problematic the deeper you go. In deep hip flexion, that's when you see more incidences of femoral acetabular impingement syndrome, FAI. That happens when you go deep and you actually impinge on the structures. And it's not only our hip anatomy that differs drastically from one individual to the next, it's also our glute anatomy. Check out this picture here of this woman kneeling. You see that the glute max actually inserts lower onto the femur than you would assume. And some people have much lower glute max insertions than others. Like here's my friend Daraja. She's known for having lower glute max insertions compared to other competitors. And it's nice in bikini to have this because the glute appears much fuller. It helps out with different poses, but I want to direct you guys to a paper published by Duda. This was published like 30 years ago. The paper was titled Variability of Femoral Muscle Attachments. So this first image just shows you the 6 specimens they used. So you can see they're between 67 and 81 years old. So older subjects, you got 4 males and 2 females. You got totally different femur and tibia lengths, okay? Now this next image I want to show you shows the different specimens, right? So you look at the muscles on the left, gluteus maximus 1, 2, and 3. 1 is the upper glute max, 2 is the middle glute max, and 3 is the lower glute max. So on the left is the area of the femoral muscle attachment, so you can see how it differs from specimens 1 through 6. In particular, look at specimen 1, having way more lower glute max area than upper glute max area, whereas specimen 3 has way more upper glute max area compared to lower for the muscle attachments. And then we slide over to the right and we look at muscle volumes. It just has specimen 3, 4, 5, and 6. But yeah, look at specimen 3. Look how crazy the muscle volume is of the lower glute max. And look at specimen 5, how small the upper glute max volume is. Now look at the next image, and this shows you moment arms. This is your leverage, and they average the leverages together of hip extension, abduction, external rotation to get a good picture of what the glute max is doing for these different individuals, and this is insane. Look at specimen number 3. This is millimeters, so 100 millimeters, so 10 centimeter moment arm for the lower glute max for specimen 3. So you look at specimen 3 and 4, they have really good leverage of the glutes, where you look at specimen 5 and 6, they do not have good leverage. Specimen 6, you got 1.8 centimeters and 2.2 centimeters leverage for their gluteus maximus. This is insane. So you're seeing almost a 5 times greater leverage with one individual compared to the next. And remember, torque equals muscle force times the moment arm. Think of a wrench. The turning force, or the torque I produce with the wrench, is going to be equal to the force I put into the wrench times the distance between where I apply the force and the center of rotation. So moment arm is half the battle here. So this just goes to show you how different our glutes are, and this might influence how well we activate the glutes, because if you have better leverage, you think your central nervous system would incorporate the glutes more if you have great leverage. But I digress. Let's dive into our conclusions. I've come up with 6 conclusions from the available evidence. The first is that anecdotes, EMG, hip loading, stretch, they just provide clues. They can't be used for really solid evidence. They're just clues. The second is that tension is very promising, but more work needs to be done with the modeling softwares to make sure we're providing accurate levels of tension. In this case, we don't know whether OpenSim accurately measures muscle force or not. It has a lot to do with the resting sarcomere length, because at resting position, different muscles have different beginning starting length, and then they have different levels of stretch throughout the range of motion, and this greatly influences how much active versus passive force you receive throughout the range of motion. But I do think that muscle force could accurately predict muscle hypertrophy over time. I just don't think we're there yet. The third conclusion is that it's a pretty safe bet to me to say that if you use around 80 degrees of hip flexion or less, wider is probably going to be better for lower glute max development. If you go much deeper, beyond 80 degrees of hip flexion, then narrow might be better than sumo. So the modeling showed that 80 degrees of hip flexion, which is about right here, all the way to 30 degrees of hip hyperextension, which is probably more range than people have, the lower glute max tends to experience greater stretch and tension going wider. So if this is the range you use most, then go wider for lower glute max growth. But if you go deeper from here to here, if you tend to go really deep with things, then narrower might be better for the lower glute max. The fourth conclusion is that you need to do what's best for your hip anatomy, because what feels best for you is going to heavily influence the pain that you experience during exercise over the long haul, as well as potential damage to the structures and injuries. And this is important over, a 30, 40-year-old lifting career. So we don't pay enough attention to this. We don't talk about it enough. When you're in your teens and your 20s, all you care about is progressive overload, getting stronger. But look at pro athletes. When they're older, they're beat up. A lot of their knees are shot. There's a sweet spot for loading on the structures, and you need to care about what feels best for you, and don't just push through pain, work around it. So don't just think short-term hypertrophy over the next year, think of long-term hypertrophy over the next several decades. The fifth conclusion is, if they both feel good, do both. Do some sumo stuff, do some narrow stuff. Sometimes it feels good to do some sumo leg press. I like doing sumo hip thrust pulses from time to time. I also like going narrow, particularly on my Romanian deadlifts, and not just stance width, but but also foot flare. Sometimes keep the feet straight, sometimes turn them out more, especially for the lockout work, because one thing is certain, variety is good for adherence. And like I just said in my last point, you need to consider hypertrophy over several decades. Switching it up increases longevity as a lifter. It makes it more exciting. Variety is the spice of life. And the final and last conclusion is don't always listen to the biomechanical bros, particularly the ones who make bold, black and white claims. Unfortunately, these days, anyone can call themselves a biomechanist. Anyone can pretend that they're ahead of the research and they know everything. But until we have at least one high quality published training study, but ideally, 3 to 5, then we can't be certain about this topic. And based on all the evidence, it does make sense to include some sumo work, some wide stance work for the lower glute max. Please leave a comment. I'd love to hear what you think. Do you love sumo? Do you hate it? Does it feel good? Do you feel the glutes working more when you go wide or working less? If you love the video, make sure you hit like and please give me a follow, even though I'm the most sporadic fitness content creator on YouTube. My apologies for that, but one thing is certain. I am Bret Contreras, aka the Glute Guy.